Hey guys, how is it going? Today we are going to start SOL 6B, where we talk about the idea of checks and balances. So, to start off, I want to explain the difference between two terms you're going to see very close to each other. In fact, there's three you're going to see very close to each other. People will typically get them confused, but you have to know the difference. So, let's start with this one. You have three terms. You have separation of powers, you have checks and balances, and you have federalism. Okay. The reason why people get these terms confused is because all three have to do with the same basic idea, which is that we didn't want anyone in the government to be too powerful. We didn't want any section of the government to be too powerful. So power was separated in a bunch of different ways. Okay. The three ways that they were separated were separation of powers, checks and balances, and federalism. However, when you're talking about these things, you're talking about three different types of ways of spreading power out. Okay. So you need to understand what are the differences between the three because they will always be in questions together and you'll have to know the difference. So let's start with the first two now and we'll deal with federalism and SOL 7. Okay. So the difference between separation of powers and checks and balances. Separation of powers is when you're looking really more so at what we did in 6A. It's the idea that there are all these powers and they are spread out between three branches of government. Okay, so you have the legislative branch and all of their powers, and then you have the executive branch and all of their powers, and then the judicial branch and all of their powers. Okay, so the fact that we have all of the government's powers spread out between three branches, that is the idea of separation of powers. Okay. Next, we have the idea of checks and balances. Okay. So the difference between the two is with checks and balances, we're still looking at the idea that there are three branches. Okay. But more specifically, it's the idea that each branch of the government has specific powers that limit the powers of the other two. So the legislative branch has certain powers that limit the executive and limit the judicial. The executive branch have powers that limit the legislative and limit the judicial. And then likewise, the judicial branch has powers that limit the legislative and limit the executive. So because they all have powers that limit the powers of the other two, none of them can become too powerful in their own right because the other two branches will check them. So if the president tried to get too much power, Congress and the Supreme Court could check the president. If Congress tried to get too much power, the Supreme Court and the president could check Congress. I got mixed up with where I was. If the Supreme Court tried to grab too much power, the president and the legislative branch have powers in order to limit them from doing that. So that's the difference. Separation of powers just states that we have powers that are spread out between three branches of government. Checks and balances is the idea that each branch of government has powers that specifically limit the powers of the other two branches, and they have the ability to limit the powers of the other two branches. So now the next part you need to know is how do these branches limit each other? And this is going to be the part of the video that takes a while. So you're going to have to know these. We're going to be doing activities in the Nearpods to try to help them get into your mind. I'll try to emphasize the more important ones, the ones that you're most likely to see. However, you are responsible for all of them. So, with that being said, let's start with the legislative branch. So, I'm going to be using the terms interchangeably. At this point, you should know legislative branch means Congress, executive branch means president, judicial branch means Supreme Court. So, if I say legislative checks president, you should know Congress is checking the president, legislative is checking executive. It's the same thing. Okay. So, let's get started with that. Let's start with the legislative branch. How does Congress check the president? Okay. The first way is that Congress has the ability to override vetoes. Okay. And we're going to talk about vetoes when we get to the president. Okay. But the first way is that Congress has the ability to override a veto. All right. Second, Congress has the ability to impeach and convict an acting president. Okay, so if a president does something that's against the law, it is actually Congress's right and Congress's power to impeach them, which means to charge them with a crime, and then convict them, which would be to remove them from office if they did in fact violate that crime. Okay. Third, Congress has the ability to approve the budget. So the president, if you remember from 6A, proposes the budget, okay, but Congress has to approve it. And also in the same way, they have to approve presidential appointments. So the president has the ability to make appointments. Congress then has to approve those appointments. So if the president puts someone forward who Congress does not think is fit for the job, they can deny that request from the president, and the president would have to nominate somebody else. That's how the president checks the executive branch. Now, how does the legislative check the judicial branch? Well, it's a little shorter, okay, but there are two ways. All right. First, they have final say on who is on the court, right? The president gets to appoint federal judges, okay? Congress has to approve those appointments. So at the end of the day, no one is going to be a federal judge unless Congress says so. Okay, so they get to check the courts because they get to choose who is on the courts. And the same way that they can impeach and convict the president, they can impeach and convict federal judges. Okay, so the power of impeachment is really important for Congress. That's the legislative branch. That's how the legislative branch checks the other two. Now let's rotate, okay? How does the executive branch check the legislative branch? All right. The first way is that they propose legislation. Okay. So the president is able to propose laws and kind of put pressure on Congress to pass laws. All right. The second is that the president prepares the annual budget. Okay, so when Congress makes laws and Congress has things that it wants to do, one of the more important things is how are you going to pay for it, right? Where is the funding coming from? So Congress, in order to pay for these laws, the president has to put that stuff in the budget, and the president is the one who prepares the budget for Congress to eventually um, confirm. All right. Uh, third, Third, the president can call for special sessions of Congress. That's one that if it pops up, it's almost like a gotcha. Um, but it's very simple. If the president wants Congress to meet, the president could call for Congress to meet, and Congress has to meet. And then the big one, this is the big one that you're almost guaranteed to see on your SOL. My cat is looking at me. That you're guaranteed to see at your SOL, and you're definitely guaranteed to see on your test. The president has the power to veto laws. Veto laws. Okay, to veto means essentially when we get to 6C, you're going to see the lawmaking process. Congress has to go through this whole process, right, to create a law. And not everyone has to approve it, but it has to go through with a majority vote, okay, through both houses of Congress. And then the president could just go, no, not going to sign it, and it has to go back to Congress, and they have to override that veto. Now, what I believe it's a 67% majority vote as opposed to a simple 51%, which doesn't happen most of the time. Okay, so the president has the right to say no and veto any law that goes through Congress, forcing Congress to then have to use their power of overriding a veto if they want that law to happen. And 99% of the time, it doesn't happen at this video and I need a haircut. Okay, I'm gonna have to get to that. Um, Next, how can the president check the courts? Well, the president can check the ports, can check, can check the courts by first appointing judges. Okay, if someone is on the Supreme Court, if someone is on a federal court, it's because the president nominated that person. So the president gets to more or less choose who is on. Of course, we know that Congress has to approve that appointment, but the president is the one who puts the name forward. Okay. And the second part is that the president can grant what is called a pardon, meaning if someone is convicted of a federal crime, the president has the power to pretty much override the justice system and say this person is pardoned. Um, so that is how they could kind of check the courts. If the courts make a mistake, the president could override um, the decision. Okay. And then the last one, which is the easiest one for the judicial branch. How does the judicial branch check the other two branches? And I told you were going to have to know it. It's going to keep coming up. The judicial branch checks the other two branches simply with judicial review. Okay. Remember, judicial review says the Supreme Court can decide what is or is not constitutional. So if something goes against the Constitution, the Supreme Court could say, it's done. Okay? So, how is that a check or how is that a balance? Well, if Congress passes a law that the Supreme Court says is unconstitutional, it's no longer a law. The Supreme Court can strike a law down even after it goes through Congress. Okay? Likewise, if the president does something that goes against the Constitution, the Supreme Court can rule that executive action, that executive order, unconstitutional, therefore making it null and void, saying it cannot happen. Okay, so by having final say on what the Constitution means and having the power of judicial review, the Supreme Court can nullify really anything that comes out of the executive branch or Congress.